The short answer is that my research group is trying to develop new materials to solve problems related to energy and sustainability. Going into a little more detail, there may be three aspects that are important. The first is the class of materials that we're working on. So we're working on nanoporous materials, materials that have small pores inside with large internal surface area. And we're mostly working with a class of materials known as metal organic frameworks, or MOFs. And these are synthesized in a very interesting way from metal nodes, which are then connected by organic linker molecules. And so these form three-dimensional crystalline frameworks or scaffolds with a large amount of empty space inside. And these structures are really dictated by these building blocks. So you can choose different metal nodes and different organic linkers that have different connectivity, different length of the organic molecule will give you different pore sizes. And you can think about incorporating different chemical functionalities into these pores in a very specific way. And you can use these materials then for a variety of applications. And one of the major questions my group thinks about is how to design particular materials for different applications. And the way my group contributes to that is by doing molecular level modeling of these materials. So we collaborate with people that synthesize them and test them and characterize them. But my group is modeling these materials. And because the properties are so sensitive to small changes at the molecular level, we're modeling them at the atomic level. So we're using large-scale computer simulations at the molecular level, trying to predict their macroscopic behavior, their macroscopic performance. And increasingly, we're also using machine learning and methods from data science and artificial intelligence as a way to speed up the screening or selection of materials for different applications. And then, so what sort of applications, what sort of problems are we trying to solve? One general class of problems is related to separating mixtures. So this is important in the environmental area. So for example, removing contaminants from water. It also occurs a lot in the chemical industry, where you have, say, after a reaction, you have a mixture of molecules, and you want to separate out the ones you want from the ones that maybe can be recycled or reused. And those separations often take a lot of energy. And so we're trying to develop materials that would provide lower energy alternatives to that sort of industrial process. And in particular, one separation that's very much related to sustainability is capture of carbon dioxide, or CO2. So people are thinking about, could we capture the CO2 coming out of a power plant, or eventually things like steel manufacturing or cement manufacturing, where it's difficult to come up with alternative energy methods. Could we capture the CO2 coming out of those processes? And ultimately, people even think about, could we capture CO2 directly out of the air? And that's a very challenging problem, but we're trying to work on materials that would be useful for a variety of these sorts of applications. Well, like many scientists, I think the newest project is often, the one you get most excited about. And the newest project in my group currently is a project on capturing water out of the air. So this is a project sponsored by the military, but you can also imagine a lot of humanitarian applications. And the idea is, like I said, to really capture water out of the air, so sometimes called atmospheric water harvesting. And what the military would like is a device about the size of a canteen that somebody could carry, and that it would provide about 5 liters of water per day, even out of fairly dry air. And so we're trying to come up with materials that could go into this device that would do that. So you would imagine passing air through the device and having this sort of spongy material in there that selectively binds water over the other molecules in air, which are mostly oxygen and nitrogen. So you want to bind the water strongly. On the other hand, eventually then you need to get the water back out of the materials. You need to release the water. And so you don't want to bind it too strongly, because the way that we're proposing to get the water back out is to heat the material. And so it's going to cost energy. And so the more strongly you bind the more strongly you bind the water, the more energy it will cost. And so there's some trade-off here. And so, yeah, my group is doing modeling, proposing different materials, evaluating them on the computer. My colleague, Professor Omar Farha, is synthesizing and testing materials. And then we're part of a team. So we're working with Honeywell, which is a large corporation. They're doing the device engineering, trying to come up with the device that would do this, that would use these materials. And then there's a small startup company called Numat Technologies involved in the integration between the material and the device. So yeah, I'm quite excited. I think beyond the military applications, you could imagine circumstances where water supply has been disrupted due to natural disasters or other reasons, and a device like this could be really useful. That's an interesting question. And it makes me sort of think about how failure looks in different fields. When we're doing modeling, a failure often could mean the results don't match the experiments. And we try to use those failures to learn something, because usually what it means is the model just is missing something. We're missing some piece of the physics that we didn't realize was important. And so we can learn something. Sometimes we've discovered the models are good enough that it causes our experimental colleagues to go back and reevaluate their experiments. And so that was sort of an unexpected development as the models got better. On the experimental end, and I have done experiments over the years, sometimes the characterization or the testing, it just doesn't work out. And, you just sort of have to go with that and move on, come up with other ideas. And then I've also found it's very interesting working with synthetic chemists. We'll come up with ideas. Oh, we're going to make this type of material. And it looks good on paper. And, we convince other people, we get the funding. And they go into the lab and realize chemistry is just complicated. And sometimes what you thought would happen just isn't going to happen. And so when this happens, my group has to become adaptable then. Oh, the project was going to go in one direction and we were all set to do that, but they can't make the materials. And so we have to come up with a different route. And so sometimes that's challenging for new PhD students. They get very attached to the initial plan, and you have to explain, well, we're going to have to go a different route because that's just the way the experiments worked out. I think curiosity is the first thing that comes to my mind. You have to, wonder how the world works, how we can come up with new engineering solutions to problems, not being satisfied with what we have. Even just in evaluating results, being curious about, well, this agrees pretty well, but why doesn't it agree even better, say, between modeling and an experiment? Another characteristic I think is important is perseverance. Just sticking with it when things are tough, because understanding the natural world is complicated, and these things take time, and you just have to stick with it. Even when things don't go well, they'll go better in the future, and just keep going. And then the third one I would mention is honesty. Of course, we want to be honest in presenting our results to other researchers, presenting them to the public. But you also have to be honest with yourself. How is the agreement good enough here, or those sorts of things, where just being critical of your own results, in the sense of being honest with yourself, I think can also be very, very important in science. I think one of the advantages of the American system is that researchers have more independence earlier in their careers. After I finished my PhD, I spent a year and a half in Leipzig as a postdoc, and then I came here to Northwestern University as an assistant professor. And so I was 29 years old. And as an assistant professor, I had my own research group. I wasn't working for somebody else. And I think there are a lot of advantages to letting young researchers start off fairly early in their careers on their own. And if you're at a good place or have good mentors other places, you're not completely on your own. You still have mentors, people who can give you advice, which is very important at that stage in your career. One thing that really impressed me in the German system is the research infrastructure. And of course, we have great facilities here in the US, but I was very impressed in Germany, and not just with the equipment, but with the research staff, with the technicians that keep that equipment going. And again, not just the equipment, but also they retain expertise around a particular research area that's hard to keep if, as here in the US, if I only have PhD students and postdocs, when they graduate, sometimes some of that expertise leaves. And the larger group style that's traditionally common in Germany, I think does have this advantage in terms of maintaining that expertise and allowing researchers to go very deeply into particular areas. Well, I've enjoyed doing research in the US and in Germany, and I'm not going to answer that question. Increasingly, I read both. When research articles first come out, I will often look at them online first. I mean, of course, that's where they appear. That's what's easiest. And sometimes that's enough. I can get a quick look at it, get what I want. I don't need to print it out. But if I really want to study something, I like to print it out. I like to be able to write in the margin, and I just find it easier to absorb information off of something that's printed. I'll give a sort of general answer. I really recommend to new researchers to find monographs in your field. Something beyond a textbook. Textbooks tend to be very broad. Research articles are very specific. But a good monograph on the topic that you're interested in, I think, can be a really useful resource. When I was a PhD student, I was doing molecular modeling, and a book came out while I was a student called Computer Simulations of Liquids by Allen and Tildesley. And the timing was perfect. I was a new PhD student, and I didn't just read this book. I devoured it. I read it and reread it. And of course, there were sections in that book that were very pertinent. I was using those methods, implementing them, perhaps writing my own codes. But there were other parts of the book that were just good general background knowledge for someone working in the field and methods that I've used later in my career that I learned about in that book. And so I think for new researchers, finding a good monograph that's going to provide a lot of depth, but also breadth of related topics in your field can be a great way to get going. When I was a student, I took a long time to figure out what I wanted to study. I started in chemical engineering because I liked chemistry and I liked math, and people told me you could have a good career in that field. But I thought about switching into physics many times. And so if I were to do it over, I might think about physics. In the end, though, I was really happy with chemical engineering. It's a very broad field. It sits sort of between chemistry and physics and biology. There's a lot of math, but it's also practically oriented. And in today's world, a lot of the interesting things in science and research are happening at the interfaces between different fields. And chemical engineering sits very nicely at a lot of these interfaces. So for me, it's been a good fit. On the other hand, who knows, if I were 18, there are things that I hadn't even thought about at that age. Something like linguistics, which I now think is quite interesting, wasn't even on my radar. So who knows? I spent about 2 years living in Leipzig, first as a postdoc in the mid-90s, and then 6 months on sabbatical in 2009. And I really enjoyed my time there, both professionally and personally. And so for young researchers, I would recommend, if you have the chance to do a postdoc or study abroad, study in another country, I highly recommend it. And I hope that I will have the chance to come back and visit Leipzig again.